What happens when a warship fires on a target the size of an aircraft carrier, and the country that owns it can't do a single thing to stop it? That's exactly what happened in the Gulf of Oman, and what came next changed the entire shape of a war that most people still don't fully understand. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel breaks down the real story behind the headlines, the details the news cycle skips past in 30 seconds. Tap like if you want more of this. Let's get into it. It was April 19th, 2026. Out on the water near the Strait of Hormuz, a massive Iranian-flagged container ship called the Touska was moving toward Bandar Abbas, an Iranian port, almost 300 meters long, heavy enough to rival a warship in size, and under United States Treasury sanctions for its ties to Iran's state shipping line. The U.S. Navy destroyer USS Spruance spotted it and gave the order to stop. The Touska didn't listen, not once, not twice. For 6 straight hours, American forces radioed warning after warning, telling the crew to halt, to turn back, to comply with the blockade the United States had placed on every Iranian port just days earlier. 6 hours is a long time to ignore a warship. 6 hours is long enough for a captain to think it through, to weigh the risk, to change course if he wanted to. The Touska's crew didn't change course, and when the deadline ran out, the Spruance didn't hesitate. The destroyer opened fire not at the hull, not to sink the ship, but with pinpoint accuracy into the engine room. A calculated strike meant to cripple, not destroy. Within minutes, the massive vessel sat dead in the water, completely powerless, drifting in open sea with nowhere to go and no way to run. That's when the second phase began. Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit lifted off from the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli by helicopter, soared low across the Arabian Sea, and rappelled straight down onto the deck of a ship that, hours earlier, had belonged entirely to Iran. No gunfire from the boarding party, no prolonged fight. Just trained Marines securing a nearly 900-foot vessel in a matter of minutes, methodically, like they had rehearsed it 100 times because they had. By the time the sun came up, the Touska belonged to nobody but the United States military. Now here's the part that made this moment so much bigger than one ship on one morning. This wasn't a random encounter at sea. It was the direct result of a blockade the United States had imposed on Iran just 6 days earlier, after peace talks in Islamabad completely collapsed. Let's rewind further, because you need the full picture to understand why any of this happened at all. This war didn't start in April. It started on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated wave of airstrikes against Iranian military targets, a campaign that included the assassination of Iran's supreme leader. That single event sent the entire region into chaos. In the weeks that followed, Iran responded the way it has for years when cornered, through its most powerful economic weapon, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow stretch of water isn't just another shipping route. Roughly a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas pass through that strait every single year. Whoever controls it controls a piece of the global economy. Iran began threatening ships, boarding vessels, laying mines. Tankers stopped moving, insurance companies pulled coverage, shipping companies froze operations rather than risk their crews. The global energy market started to shake, and every government with a stake in that water started paying very close attention. So the United States made its move. On April 13th, 2026, after ceasefire talks in Islamabad fell apart, Washington announced a full naval blockade of Iranian ports. Nothing in, nothing out. Not without American permission. More than a dozen warships spread out across the Arabian Sea and the Strait itself, backed by an aircraft carrier strike group. The message was simple. If you try to break through, you will be stopped. The rules were made public before a single ship was ever touched. Warning shots first. If that failed, boarding by force. No secrets, no ambiguity. Everyone operating in that water knew exactly what would happen if they defied the blockade. The Touska was the first ship to actually test it, and it failed that test in 6 hours. Iran's reaction was immediate and furious. Within hours of the seizure, Iranian officials were calling it an act of piracy, a violation of international law, a hostile act of war disguised as law enforcement. Iran's Joint Military Command released a statement promising the country would, in their words, respond and retaliate against what they called American armed piracy. But here's what made this moment strange and worth paying close attention to. Iran didn't strike back immediately. For a government known for loud, fast retaliation, the silence that followed felt unusual. According to Iranian state media, part of the hesitation came down to something surprisingly human. Crew family members were reportedly connected to people aboard the Touska, and Iran said it didn't want to risk their safety with a hasty military response. That's a rare moment of honesty from a government that almost never explains its own restraint. And it revealed something deeper than just concern for a handful of sailors. It revealed just how boxed in Iran actually was. The regime needed to look strong for its own people. It needed to prove it wasn't going to let a superpower humiliate it on open water and walk away untouched. But it also knew that striking back too hard could drag it into a fight it had no chance of winning outright. That's the impossible position a country finds itself in when it no longer holds military superiority in its own backyard. While the world watched the fallout from the seizure, investigators started digging into where the Touska had actually come from, and that's when things got more complicated. In the days before heading toward the Strait, the ship had anchored off a port in Southeast Asia for more than a week, a location known in shipping circles as a transit point commonly used to move sanctioned goods while avoiding international tracking systems. 9 days is not a quick refueling stop. 9 days suggests planning. The official cargo manifest was thin on details, which only fueled more questions. What exactly was on board when it was seized remains murky to this day. What we do know is that its capture became the first physical seizure since the blockade began, and every government watching understood the deeper message being sent. The United States was demonstrating that it could reach out and grab an Iranian vessel almost anywhere in the region, without asking permission from anyone. President Trump didn't wait for a formal Pentagon briefing to announce what had happened. He posted about it directly, describing the standoff in blunt, unmistakable terms. The ship tried to run the blockade, it was warned, it refused, and the Navy stopped it cold. No diplomatic softening, no careful phrasing, just a direct public declaration that the United States had used force against an Iranian vessel and was not apologizing for it. That kind of bluntness wasn't accidental. It was a message aimed far beyond Iran itself. It was a message to every ship captain in the region thinking about testing the blockade. It was a message to any nation quietly helping Iranian shipping slip through sanctions. It was a reminder to the rest of the world that American naval power in that stretch of ocean was not up for negotiation. Before we go further into how Iran actually struck back and how this single ship seizure pulled the entire region deeper into crisis, take a second to like this video if you're finding this useful. It genuinely helps this kind of deep fact-based breakdown reach more people instead of the surface-level headlines everyone else is putting out. So how did Iran respond once it finally decided to act? Rather than directly confronting American warships, which would have invited a level of firepower Iran simply could not match, Tehran went back to a strategy it has used for more than a decade whenever it feels cornered at sea: seize someone else's ship and use it as leverage. Within days of losing the Touska, Iran's Revolutionary Guard naval forces captured 2 foreign-flagged commercial tankers near Iranian waters and pulled them into Iranian territory. The official reasoning offered was vague, something about maritime violations. But almost nobody watching believed that was the real motive. The real goal was leverage. Hostages in the form of cargo ships and crews, something Iran could hold on to and negotiate with once talks resumed, if talks resumed at all. This is a pattern that maritime analysts have documented for years. When Iran feels militarily outmatched, it doesn't challenge the stronger power head-on. It grabs something smaller, something civilian, something that creates a diplomatic headache without inviting outright war. It's worked before. But this time, with an entire carrier strike group sitting in the region and a blockade already choking its economy, it looked less like strength and more like a country running out of better options. Iranian officials didn't stop there. Some floated the idea of demanding transit fees from any vessel trying to move through the Strait, essentially trying to reassert control over water they no longer had the military strength to actually control. It was less a policy and more a performance, a way to look powerful in front of a domestic audience, even as the country's naval capabilities were being steadily worn down. An Iranian state commentary leaned hard into comparisons with past disputes, drawing parallels to other nations that have had tankers seized by the United States over sanctions violations. The comparison wasn't flattering. It placed Iran in a long line of countries that had lost ships to American naval power and been forced to accept it. Since the blockade first went into effect, the United States has reported intercepting dozens of vessels attempting to move in or out of Iranian waters, according to U.S. Central Command figures. Independent maritime tracking groups estimated that only a small fraction of ships that would normally pass through the Strait actually managed to get through during that period. The blockade, by nearly every available measure, was working exactly as intended, and it was working at a brutal cost to Iran's economy, with U.S. officials estimating hundreds of millions of dollars in losses accumulating daily. But the economic squeeze wasn't the only thing tightening around Iran. In the weeks following the Touska seizure, American and Allied strikes against Iranian military infrastructure intensified. Radar installations, drone storage sites, naval assets, anything connected to Iran's ability to threaten shipping in the Strait became a target. Officials close to the campaign said the goal was straightforward: strip Iran of the tools it would need to make good on any of its threats. This is the part that's easy to miss if you're only watching headlines. A blockade at sea and an air campaign on land were happening at the same time, feeding into each other. Every strike that degraded Iran's military made the blockade harder to break. Every ship stopped at sea made Iran's economic position more desperate. It was pressure applied from two directions simultaneously, and it left the Iranian government with almost no room to maneuver. Meanwhile, back home in the United States, the war wasn't just a headline people scrolled past. Instability in one of the world's most important oil corridors pushed energy markets into turmoil. When a region responsible for a quarter of the world's seaborne oil becomes a war zone, prices don't stay calm. Fuel costs climbed. Businesses that depend on shipping and transport felt the squeeze. This wasn't a distant conflict for ordinary people watching their bills go up. It reached directly into household budgets. Diplomatically, the picture kept shifting. A ceasefire negotiated in the weeks before the Touska seizure was already fragile, and Iran accused Washington of violating it through the blockade itself. Talks scheduled to take place in Islamabad were thrown into serious doubt. Iran's foreign ministry made it clear it had no intention of sending negotiators to the table, while what it called an act of war was still unfolding at sea. And through it all, Iran's public messaging never wavered. Officials kept insisting that Iran, not Washington, would be the one to decide how and when this conflict ended. It's the kind of statement that sounds defiant on the surface but reveals something else underneath. A government that knows it's losing ground militarily has one tool left that can't be bombed or blockaded: the story it tells its own people. As long as that story holds, the leadership can survive even while its navy sits crippled in port. Here's something worth pausing on. Regimes rarely collapse the moment they start losing. They collapse or they change course when they can no longer convince their own population that they're still winning. That's the real battle happening underneath all of this. Not just ships and missiles, but the fight over public perception inside Iran itself. Before we go into what happened next and how this entire standoff eventually reached a turning point, drop a comment below telling me what you think Iran's next move should have been. Seizing more ships? Going back to the table? Or doubling down on defiance? I want to see your take, and I read every single one. As the weeks rolled on, the pressure Iran was under kept compounding. With its naval assets degraded and its economy hemorrhaging money daily under the blockade, Tehran leaned even harder on a strategy it has relied on for years, using regional proxy forces to apply pressure without directly engaging the United States Navy. Attacks tied to Iran-aligned groups targeting shipping elsewhere in the region added even more instability to already fragile oil markets, pushing prices higher and rattling global supply chains far beyond the Persian Gulf itself. At the same time, a new kind of pressure emerged, one that didn't involve missiles or warships at all. Reports emerged that damages caused by attacks linked to Iranian-backed forces could be paid for using frozen Iranian assets, funds the United States had held for years. If true, it represented an entirely different kind of leverage, not a blockade you could try to run, not a strike you could brace for. A financial mechanism that turned Iran's own money against itself, shrinking with every attack carried out in its name. Iranian officials reportedly called the idea a dangerous precedent, warning that if frozen state assets could be redirected like that, no country's holdings abroad would ever feel secure again. Through late April and into May, the situation remained tense but increasingly unsustainable for Iran. A country losing ships, absorbing steady military pressure, and bleeding money by the day cannot hold that position indefinitely. Eventually, something has to give. And on May 29, 2026, after continued back-channel negotiations, the United States announced the end of the naval blockade. Weeks of pressure, one very public ship seizure, and mounting economic damage had pushed both sides back toward the negotiating table, even if trust between them remained almost non-existent. That doesn't mean the underlying conflict simply vanished. Ceasefires in this war have proven fragile before, breaking down and reigniting more than once. The core tension that started this entire chain of events, control over one of the most valuable shipping corridors on the planet, never fully disappeared. It simply moved from open combat back into an uneasy, closely watched standoff. So what does the Touska incident actually tell us once you step back from the individual moment and look at the bigger picture? It tells us that in modern conflict, a single ship can become a symbol far larger than its cargo. The Touska wasn't just a vessel, it became a test of American resolve, a measure of Iranian military decline, and a warning shot, literally and figuratively, to every nation watching how far the United States was willing to go to enforce its blockade. It tells us that economic warfare and military pressure increasingly move together, not separately. The blockade wasn't just about stopping ships. It was about starving an economy of its lifeline while simultaneously degrading the military that might otherwise protect that lifeline. Two forms of pressure applied at once, designed to leave almost no path forward except negotiation. And it tells us something about how modern regimes survive pressure like this, not through military victory, because Iran clearly wasn't achieving that, but through narrative control, through convincing enough people at home that defiance itself is a form of winning, even when every measurable outcome says otherwise. The story of the Touska began with 6 hours of silence from a crew that refused to stop. It ended with a nation forced to accept a reality it never wanted to admit, that in this stretch of water, at this moment in history, it no longer held the power it once did. What happens next in that region is still being written. Ceasefires that have broken down before could break down again. Economic pressure that eased in May could return in a different form. The underlying dispute over who controls the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most valuable pieces of ocean on Earth, has not gone away. It has simply gone quiet for now. But if there's one thing this entire chain of events proves, it's that in today's world, a war doesn't need massive battles to reshape a region. Sometimes all it takes is one ship, 6 hours of warnings, and a decision that changes everything that follows. If this breakdown helped you actually understand what happened out there better than the headlines did, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of clear, honest analysis instead of noise. Share this with someone who's been trying to make sense of this conflict, and let me know in the comments what part of this story surprised you the most. I'll see you in the next one.